All right, and the next thing we're going to talk about here is amending the Constitution. So we know that the Constitution is this 230-year-old document, and was written in a time when there was no electricity or trains, even cars. Um, Certainly not things like TV and the internet and all that advanced technology we have today. And the framers of the Constitution, um, in their wisdom, wrote in a way to change the Constitution. They wanted it to be a living document and be able to change as the world changed. And the way that they did this was through the amendment process. So we have 27 amendments to the Constitution, and the first 10 were written 2 years after the Constitution was ratified. They were promised when the states decided to ratify the Constitution. We call this the Bill of Rights. 11 through 27, though, have come in over the last 230 years. And our 27th Amendment, the most recent amendment, was passed in the 90s, although it was written in 1789. And I believe the actual 11th Amendment was passed in the 1790s. So over 200 years, we've seen 17 amendments kind of come trickling in at different times. And it's a really hard thing to do. It's a really hard thing to get an amendment to the Constitution passed. And the framers of the Constitution did that on purpose. They didn't want it to be easy to change this document, so people would just kind of run around willy-nilly changing it whenever they felt like it. But instead, they wanted to make this a really difficult thing so that people were sure that they wanted to do it, that the changes were something that everyone agreed upon. It's interesting that...
It's my break, Daddy.
I'm sorry. So it was supposed to be a difficult thing to do, to get an amendment passed to the Constitution, which is literally changing the Constitution. When the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution, which all came at the end of the Civil War, they actually required that a line be drawn through certain parts of the Constitution that talk about slavery. And it's interesting when you look at the Constitution today, they didn't just erase that part and pretend like it never happened. They drew a line through it, but they made it so you can still see it. So we never forget that at one point, slavery was enshrined in the Constitution, and we had to erase it after the Civil War. But let's not pretend like it wasn't there, right? We're not going to erase it completely. We're just going to draw a line through it, but you can still read it. Okay, so interesting fact. Also, the 18th Amendment is another interesting one. It's prohibition. It outlawed alcohol. And 30 years later, they changed their mind. They said, never mind, we want to drink. And they passed the 21st Amendment, which then ended prohibition. So there have been these moments where we see actual erasing of the Constitution. But it's not ever a complete erasing or deleting like you would on a computer file, but we're drawing a line through it, or maybe highlighting it and saying this is no longer valid, but let's not forget that this happened. And there's a reason why it happened. So how do you pass it? Right, is the big question. And what you need to do, and we'll take a look down here, it takes 2/3 votes in the House and the Senate. Now we know that nothing gets through the House and the Senate with 2/3 vote nowadays. Everything is so partisan. It's unbelievable. We aren't having any cooperation in our government today, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your belief system. But it would take a 2/3 vote from the House and the Senate, plus 75% of the states then approving the amendment for it to happen. I mean, this is unheard of stuff, right? This is incredibly difficult to get done. In fact, in the 1970s, when our politics was much more cooperative, we've learned that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, for 5 decades, American politicians worked together to do what was right for the country. It wasn't such a polarized country as we have today. But in the 70s, they passed an amendment called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And it's a really, really short amendment. It says like women should have equal rights to men under the law, period. I mean, that's not the exact quote, but there, 25 words. It's a simple, simple thing. And 2/3 of the House passed it, and 2/3 of the Senate passed it. And when it went to the states, all of a sudden there was a push by conservative groups to not pass it because so the ERA. So it passed. So it passed the House and the Senate. It goes to the states. The states are passing it. I mean, who doesn't want equality between men and women enshrined in the Constitution? But there was a conservative group who said, if you do this, it's going to lead to the breakdown of the family. Okay, it's going to lead to women not playing the traditional role of women. And since it was a conservative group, oftentimes when we say conservative, in America, it's kind of connected to the Republican Party, right? And the word liberal is kind of connected to the Democratic Party. But historically speaking, those terms mean more than just what they mean in this moment of 2020 politics. Conservatives oftentimes look backwards and say, man, things were so good back then, let's keep things that way. They don't want change. The liberal groups are often the ones who are looking forward, they're wanting change. We've seen this throughout history. These terms have been used in that way. So today, when we talk about conservatives, maybe the Republican Party kind of looks back at the past and says things were better back then, and we want to keep it that way. We don't want change. And the Democrats who are branded the liberals are the party who is looking to make changes and maybe progress culturally. Maybe not. But anyway, in this moment, to get back to my story, in the 1970s, the conservative movement stopped. I think there were 4 states short. I think 34 states signed on, and they needed 4 more states to pass the ERA, and equality between men and women would be enshrined in the Constitution. And then people have asked me, they say, so what does that matter, right? I mean, can't we just use the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment to give women equality under all circumstances? And that is what's used in court. Okay, whenever an issue comes up of women's rights, they use the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, which provides for equality between citizens. But I've also then heard when people who are in favor of the ERA saying, but that's difficult to prove. It's harder to prove the Equal Protections Amendment of the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment to protect women's rights. And what would be easier if there was a very simple spelled out, women get all rights as men under the law, 28th Amendment of the Constitution, which would make it so when you go to court, you don't have to try and argue this vague clause of an amendment that was passed 150 years ago, but you can say, no, look, all women have equal rights, don't mess with me. Easier to prove in court. Okay, so why the Equal Rights Amendment? This is why, and I'm not trying to say I'm pro equal rights or against the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, that's a personal choice. But it's the best example of how difficult it is to get an amendment passed. And what we found was that over the last 50 years, since this passed in the 70s, maybe 45 years, it was near when I was born, some of the states have then passed it, right? And most recently, Illinois and Virginia, I forget the other ones that just passed it like 5 years ago, okay? But because there was only a 10-year window for all of the states to approve it, it didn't get pushed through. And then now a few of the states have withdrawn. They said, okay, well, now we got 38 out of 50 states, let's pass the ERA. And some of the states said, I know we voted in the 70s, yes, but we're taking it back. So it's a really hard process. And I think that that's really an important thing to understand. So people will say like, oh, let's eliminate the Electoral College. Yeah, but the Electoral College is the 11th Amendment. It would take an amendment to do that, which would mean it would take this 2/3 of the House and Senate plus 75% of the states to approve. That is really hard to do. Okay, let's take money out of politics. Hip you, an amendment to do that. Hip you suggest gerrymandering, whatever your thing is. It's a really difficult process, and with politics being the way they are today, it's probably highly unlikely that an amendment be passed. There's another way though, and that's to do it through a state convention. I believe the 21st Amendment was passed this way, where they say, well, look, federal government, you're not doing your job. So we're going to, as states, we're going to call together all the states, and we're going to have a convention. And within this convention, we're going to vote. 75% of us will vote to pass this amendment and will bypass Congress. So that's another route to get there, although it's only been done one time, and I believe that was because they wanted their booze so badly. They're like, give me my alcohol back. If Congress won't listen, we'll do it the other way. And the states were able to get it passed that way. But look, bottom line, really, really hard to pass an amendment. And we've seen some examples I've tried to bring up as to why it's hard, or how hard it is. And then we know it was meant to be hard. Right? The framers of the Constitution said we don't want it to be easy to change this document, to amend it. So we're going to make it really, really difficult to get that done.